The complete history of ancient Israel. Jerusalem burns. Jerusalem was burning. Stone walls that had stood for generations shook beneath heat and impact. Smoke climbed into the sky, darkening the hills around the city. Flames consumed homes, storehouses, and sacred spaces. The great temple, center of worship, memory, and identity, collapsed into fire and dust. People fled through narrow streets. Others hid behind walls that no longer protected them. The sounds of destruction echoed through the city as one of the ancient world's most important centers fell. This was not just the destruction of buildings. It was the collapse of a way of life. To the empires watching from afar, this moment looked final. Another small kingdom erased. Another name removed from the map. But history would soon reveal something unexpected. Because Jerusalem did not vanish from memory, and neither did its people. The question that still echoes across centuries is simple, but unsettling. How did a small, divided people survive destruction after destruction, and still refuse to disappear? To find the answer, we must go back, long before kingdoms, before temples, before walls. Back to a land where survival was never guaranteed. A land between empires. Long before there was a nation called Israel, this land was a crossroads. It sat between powerful civilizations, Egypt to the south, Mesopotamian empires to the north and east. Armies passed through it. Traders crossed it. Empires fought over it. Control of this land meant control of movement, commerce, and influence. But for those who lived here, it meant uncertainty. Small communities settled near water sources, hills, and fertile valleys. They farmed, herded animals, and built modest villages. Drought was common. Conflict was frequent. Survival required adaptation. There were no natural barriers to protect them. No massive rivers. No wide plains that favored defense. This land demanded endurance. Over generations, the people who lived here learned a lesson that would shape everything that followed. Security could disappear overnight. Identity, remembered, could endure longer. A people before a kingdom. By the late Bronze Age, these communities shared something unusual. They were not united by empire or monarchy. They were united by memory. Stories of ancestors, shared customs, laws passed down orally, a sense of belonging that did not depend on a palace or a throne. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals something striking. Small settlements appear in the Central Highlands. There are no grand palaces, no monumental temples, no signs of imperial wealth, just modest homes, shared spaces, community life. This was ancient Israel in its earliest form, not as a state, but as a people. Their identity was portable, and that would matter more than anyone realized, living in the shadow of giants. The surrounding world was powerful and dangerous. Egypt controlled the region at various times. Other kingdoms rose and fell nearby. Inscriptions left by foreign rulers describe campaigns, control, and conquest. This land was never ignored. Sometimes these communities paid tribute. Sometimes they were left alone. Sometimes they resisted. Every choice carried consequences. Unlike the great empires, they could not afford constant war. They survived by flexibility, by knowing when to adapt, when to submit, and when to resist. Their strength was not dominance. It was endurance. From tribes to a crown, as pressure increased, cooperation became necessary. Loose tribal groups began to unite during moments of crisis. Leaders emerged, not kings at first, but figures of authority during emergencies. Over time, the idea took root that survival required central leadership. A kingdom formed. Its early rulers governed from modest centers. Power was fragile. Loyalty shifted. Authority was questioned. This was not an empire. It was an experiment. And like all experiments, it carried risk. The rise of Jerusalem. Then attention turned to a small, defensible hilltop city. Jerusalem. It had no great river, no vast farmland, no natural wealth, but it had something else. Position, defensibility, symbolism. When Jerusalem became the capital, it transformed from a minor settlement into a center of power and meaning. Walls were strengthened. Administration expanded. Most importantly, Jerusalem became both political and spiritual. It was no longer just a city. It was an idea, and ideas are harder to destroy than walls. The kingdom, at its height, at its strongest, the kingdom controlled important trade routes and regional centers. Economic activity increased. Building projects expanded. Records became more detailed. But growth brought strain. Taxes increased to support the state. Power concentrated in the hands of a few. Disagreements emerged about leadership, justice, and responsibility. Unity was fragile, and history shows that fragile unity is often the first crack before collapse. The division. After the death of a powerful ruler, the kingdom split. To the north, Israel. To the south, Judah. Two kingdoms. One people. They competed politically. They formed separate alliances. They sometimes turned against each other. This division weakened both, and powerful empires were watching closely. The northern kingdom falls. In the 8th century BCE, a new force arrived. Assyria. Its military system was disciplined and relentless. Cities fell rapidly. The northern kingdom of Israel was conquered. Its capital destroyed. Many inhabitants were relocated. After that, the historical record grows quiet. Archaeological layers show destruction. Written records end. The northern kingdom vanished. And a chilling question remained. Could Judah survive what Israel could not? Judah stood alone. Smaller, poorer, surrounded. Jerusalem swelled as refugees arrived. Resources stretched thin. Leaders debated strategy, diplomacy, resistance, submission. Nothing offered lasting safety. Empires rose and fell around them. Time was running out. The siege. Babylon arrived. Jerusalem was surrounded. Supply lines were cut. Food became scarce. Hope faded slowly, painfully. For months, the city endured. Then the walls fell. The fall of Jerusalem. Jerusalem burned. The temple was destroyed. Leadership was removed. Many were taken into exile. This was more than defeat. It was a cultural shock. Everything that had defined stability, land, center, protection, was gone. By every historical pattern, this should have been the end. The unexpected survival. But something unexpected happened. The people did not disappear. In exile, they adapted. They preserved stories, organized communities, defined identity without territory or monarchy. They became something new. A people not dependent on a state. The historical mystery. Archaeologists today find destruction layers, exile records, administrative seals. But they also find continuity. Return. Rebuilding. Memory. The people of ancient Israel should have vanished like so many others. They did not. And that forces us to ask, what allows a defeated people to outlast the empires that destroyed them? Because the fall of Jerusalem was not the end. It was the beginning of something far more powerful. And in the next chapter, we uncover how loss became identity, and how identity reshaped history itself. After the fall, the kingdom was gone. Jerusalem's walls lay broken. Streets once filled with daily life were silent. The temple, center of worship, law, and collective identity, stood in ruins. Smoke had faded, but the loss remained. By every historical standard, this should have been the end. Across the ancient world, when a capital fell and its leaders were removed, the people followed soon after, absorbed, forgotten, erased. Ancient Israel stood at that exact moment. History expected disappearance. But history would be wronged. The journey into exile. Those taken from Judah were marched east. They crossed unfamiliar landscapes, followed rivers they had never known, and entered a world far larger and more complex than their own. Babylon, a city of immense scale. Massive walls, towers rising above flat plains. Markets crowded with languages, goods, and people from across the empire. Babylon was confident in its power. And Babylon did not treat all captives the same. Some were assigned labor. Others were allowed to settle, work, and live in communities. The people of Judah were scattered, but not erased. Life far from home. Exile was not constant punishment. Archaeological and written evidence suggests many Judeans adapted to life in Babylon. They farmed. They traded. They raised families. They lived near canals and rivers. They built new routines. But even as daily life continued, something remained unresolved. They were not home. Distance became more than geography. It became identity. The shock of loss. For generations, identity had been tied to place. Land defined belonging. The city defined security. The temple defined meaning. Now all three were gone. There was no king to lead, no capital to gather around, no central place to anchor belief and law. This forced a question few peoples had ever faced. Who are we when everything familiar is gone? The answer did not come quickly. grief and silence. At first, there was grief, confusion, disorientation, anger. Ancient records reflect this emotional shock, questions of responsibility, meaning, and future. Exile stripped away certainty. But in that uncertainty, something new began to form. The turn inward. Without land to protect or walls to rebuild, the people turned inward. They gathered to remember. Stories of ancestors were retold. Laws were discussed. Traditions were repeated carefully. These gatherings were not acts of nostalgia. They were acts of survival. Memory became protection. From oral tradition to record, Babylon was a world of writing. Records mattered. Administration depended on documentation. Law was written, preserved, referenced. Living in this environment changed how the exiles preserved their past. Traditions once passed orally were collected. Stories were organized. Laws were written down, not to dominate others, but to endure themselves. This shift marked a turning point in history. A people without power chose record and memory as their foundation. A people of memory, identity no longer depended on a city or king. It lived in shared stories, in written law, in collective memory. This made identity portable. It could travel. It could survive displacement. It could exist anywhere. This was something new in the ancient world. Life between two worlds. Exiles lived between cultures. They learned Babylonian customs and language when necessary. They participated in economic life. But they preserved their own traditions at home and in community. They adapted without dissolving. This balance reshaped them. The idea that changed history. Before exile, identity was tied to territory. After exile, identity was tied to memory. Law without kings. Community without borders. Belonging without land. This idea challenged how empires understood control, because it meant a people could survive anywhere. The fall of Babylon. Then, unexpectedly, Babylon fell. A new power rose from the east. Persia. Its conquest of Babylon was swift and relatively controlled. Instead of widespread destruction, Persian rulers followed a different policy. Displaced peoples were allowed to return home. This decision reshaped history across the region. The road back. Some exiles returned to Judah. What they found was not a restored kingdom. Fields were empty. Walls were broken. Jerusalem was quiet. Rebuilding would be slow. Not everyone returned. Many remained in Babylon and other regions, forming communities far from the land. For the first time, ancient Israel existed in multiple places at once. Rebuilding without a throne. Those who returned did not restore a monarchy. They rebuilt community. Leadership came from administrators, teachers, and legal authorities, not kings. Law replaced royal power. Memory replaced territory. Identity under foreign rule. Foreign empires continued to rule the land. Persia first, others later. Yet something remarkable happened. Despite being ruled, identity remained. The people adapted without disappearing. The pressure of change, languages shifted, cultures blended, new ideas entered daily life. Debates emerged within the community. How much change could be accepted? What must remain unchanged? These debates shaped the future. Evidence in the ground. Archaeology confirms this quiet survival. Modest homes, community buildings, administrative seals. No signs of empire, only persistence. The land was no longer powerful, but it was alive. A people transformed. By surviving exile, ancient Israel became something new. Not just a kingdom remembered, but a people defined by memory, law, and shared story. This transformation prepared them for centuries of foreign rule. The calm before the next test. Empires shifted again. Persia weakened. New powers watched the region. The land remained small and vulnerable, but identity was strong. And soon, that strength would be tested again. The historical question. Historians now ask a crucial question. Was exile a disaster or a transformation? Because without it, ancient Israel may have disappeared like so many others. Instead, it learned how to survive without power. What comes next? A new empire is approaching. Faster, more aggressive, less patient. Its arrival will force new choices about identity, adaptation, and survival. Because the next chapter is not just about foreign rule. It is about who the people choose to become. And once again, ancient Israel will stand at the edge of disappearance. A new empire rises. The ancient world rarely changed slowly. When change came, it often arrived with armies. In the late 4th century BCE, a young Macedonian king began a campaign that would reshape history. His name was Alexander. His ambition was unprecedented. Unlike earlier empires that expanded gradually, Alexander moved with astonishing speed. His armies crossed continents in years, not generations. Kingdoms that had stood for centuries fell one after another. When his forces reached the eastern Mediterranean, the land of Judah lay in their path, small, strategic, and vulnerable. There was no epic final stand recorded here. No long siege remembered in legend. Power simply changed hands. And with that quiet transition, the world of ancient Israel entered a new age, one defined not only by rulers, but by ideas. The end of Persian rule. For nearly 2 centuries, the Persian Empire had governed the region. Persian rule was not gentle, but it was practical. Local traditions were respected. Religious practices continued. Communities were largely allowed to govern themselves, as long as taxes were paid and loyalty was maintained. This arrangement allowed Jewish life to survive after exile. The temple stood rebuilt. Law, ritual, and memory endured. But by Alexander's time, Persia was weakening. Internal conflict, overstretched borders, and aging leadership made it vulnerable. When the Macedonian armies arrived, the old imperial system collapsed faster than anyone expected. What replaced it was not merely a new ruler, but a new worldview. Alexander's vision. Alexander did not simply conquer. He transformed. He believed that Greek culture, its language, education, philosophy, and civic life should unite his empire. As he founded cities across conquered lands, they followed a familiar pattern: theaters, gymnasiums, marketplaces, and schools. Greek became the language of administration and advancement. When Alexander died young, his empire fractured, but his cultural vision survived. And nowhere would that vision cause more tension than in the lands of ancient Israel. The spread of Hellenism. The Greek influence that followed Alexander is known as Hellenism. It spread through trade, education, and politics. It promised opportunity to those willing to adapt. Greek names opened doors. Greek learning offered power. Greek customs signaled belonging in the new order. For some Jews, Hellenism was not a threat, it was a tool. They believed their identity could survive alongside foreign culture. Others disagreed deeply. They saw culture not as decoration, but as foundation. And foundations, once altered, rarely remain stable. A people divided, the conflict did not begin with violence. It began with choices. Parents debated education. Should children learn Greek literature? Should they attend Greek-style schools? Leaders argued over policy. Should laws reflect tradition or adapt to new political realities? Some adopted Greek names. Others refused. Slowly, quietly, 2 paths emerged within the same people. One believed survival required change. The other believed survival required resistance. Neither side believed it was abandoning the future. Both believed they were protecting it. The temple as identity. At the center of everything stood the temple in Jerusalem. It was more than a religious building. It was the symbol of law, memory, and collective identity. Control of the temple meant control of leadership. Some elites, aligned with Greek rulers, sought to reshape religious practice to better fit the Hellenistic world. Others saw this as a betrayal not only of faith, but of history itself. This was no longer a cultural debate. It was a struggle over who the people were and who they would become. When power intervened, the Greek rulers who inherited Alexander's empire viewed the conflict pragmatically. They valued order above tradition. Stability mattered more than belief. When internal divisions threatened control, they backed leaders who promised compliance. At first, pressure was indirect. Later, it became explicit. Rules were enforced. Expectations were set. What had once been a cultural influence began to feel like coercion. The breaking point: under one ruler, policies crossed a line. Practices central to Jewish life were restricted. Sacred traditions were challenged. Communal autonomy was undermined. What had been adaptation became interference. What had been tension became crisis. For many, this was no longer about politics. It was about survival as a people. The first act of defiance, resistance, did not begin in Jerusalem. It began in a small town. An order was issued. Compliance was expected. Instead, refusal followed. That refusal spread. Families withdrew to rural areas. Small groups organized quietly. Networks formed beyond official control. This was not rebellion in the conventional sense. It was rejection, guerrilla resistance. Those who resisted lacked numbers, equipment, and formal training. But they had knowledge of the land and a powerful sense of purpose. They avoided open confrontation. They moved strategically. They relied on local support. Against expectations, they succeeded. Not through overwhelming force, but persistence, a surprising victory. Over time, control shifted. The temple was reclaimed. Traditional practices resumed. A new ruling dynasty emerged from the resistance. For the first time in generations, the land experienced political independence. It was a moment of triumph, but also a test. Because victory changes priorities. Power after liberation. Independence brought challenges the resistance had never faced. Internal divisions resurfaced. Leadership became contested. Authority shifted from moral resistance to political control. What began as unity fractured into factions. The state survived, but its foundation weakened. Identity becomes politics. Groups formed around different visions of the future. Some demanded strict tradition. Some promoted selective adaptation. Some sought influence and power. The old question returned, but now it divided rulers, not rebels. Rome watches. Beyond the region, a new power was rising. Rome expanded carefully, strategically, and relentlessly. It valued order, hierarchy, and control, and it noticed instability. The Roman entrance. Rome did not arrive as an enemy. It arrived as an ally, then as an arbiter, finally, as a ruler. Local leadership remained, but only with Roman approval. Independence faded without dramatic collapse. But memory remained. Life under Rome. Roman rule brought infrastructure and administration, but also taxation, oversight, and limits on autonomy. Some adapted. Some resisted quietly. Others waited. The past was remembered differently by each group. Rising expectations. Across the land, ideas circulated. Hope for justice. Hope for restoration. Hope for change. Not organized rebellion, but anticipation. History had taught the people to endure. But endurance always carries tension. The calm before crisis. Rome was powerful, but distant. Local conflicts intensified. Voices hardened. The land felt suspended between memory and reality. Rome had seen this pattern before, and it rarely ended without consequence. The central question: could identity survive empire? Could memory outlast domination? Or would power erase the past completely? The answer was approaching, and it would not be gentle. Fire in Jerusalem. Jerusalem did not fall in a moment. It burned over time, not as metaphor, not as prophecy, but as reality. By the late 1st century, the city had become the center of a crisis that had been building for decades. When flames finally rose above its rooftops, they marked not only destruction, but the closing of an era. What happened here would echo far beyond stone walls. Because when Jerusalem burned, an entire way of life was forced to change. Life under Roman rule, Roman control over Judea, did not begin with chaos. At first, it felt manageable. Local authorities remained in place. Religious life continued. Markets stayed open. But Rome governed through layers: tax collectors, governors, soldiers, and client kings. Each layer added pressure. Taxes increased steadily. Roman troops became more visible. Decisions once made locally now required imperial approval. Daily life continued, but trust eroded. A province, not a people. Rome did not see Judea as sacred land. It saw a province, a strategic location between major trade routes, a region that needed stability, not special treatment. Roman administration valued order above all else. Uniform law, predictable taxation, clear authority. But what Rome considered efficiency, the population experienced as intrusion. And no empire fully understands a land it rules without belonging to it. Economic and social strain. Pressure was not only political, it was economic. Farmers struggled under taxation. Merchants lost autonomy. Debts accumulated. Wealth concentrated in fewer hands. Meanwhile, religious and political elites competed for influence, often aligning with Roman interests to maintain power. For ordinary people, leadership no longer felt protective. It felt distant. Corruption and collapse of trust. Some of the deepest wounds came from within. Positions of authority were bought, not earned. Justice could be delayed or avoided with bribes. Sacred offices became political tools. The people no longer trusted Rome. They also no longer trusted their own leaders. When legitimacy disappears, stability follows it. Competing visions for survival. As pressure grew, responses diverged. Some believed accommodation was the only path forward. Others insisted strict religious observance would preserve identity. Some believed resistance was unavoidable. Each group claimed to protect the future, but they could not agree on what that future should be. The rise of militant resistance. Among the most radical were those who believed compromise itself was betrayal. They targeted Roman authority symbols. They disrupted tax collection. They operated quietly, blending into the population. To supporters, they were defenders. To Rome, they were criminals. At first, Rome underestimated them. That decision would prove costly. The incident that changed everything. Revolts rarely begin with grand plans. They begin with moments. A decision made without sensitivity. An action perceived as humiliation. An insult layered onto years of frustration. When that moment came, restraint collapsed. Public anger spilled into the streets. Control was lost, and Rome could not ignore it. The Great Revolt. The year was 66 CE. Rebellion erupted across Judea. Roman garrisons were attacked. Local authority structures failed. Jerusalem became the heart of resistance. Rome responded decisively. Legions were mobilized. The empire would not allow defiance to spread. The siege strategy. Rome understood sieges. It did not rush. It surrounded Jerusalem completely. No supplies entered. No one left. The city was sealed. Inside the walls, unity collapsed. Rival factions fought for control, weakening their own defense. Rome waited. Time as a weapon. As weeks passed, conditions worsened. Resources diminished. Decision-making fractured. Hope gave way to fear. The siege revealed a harsh truth. Rome did not need to destroy Jerusalem directly. The city was unraveling from within. The fall of the temple. Eventually, Roman forces breached the defenses. Street by street, fighting followed. The temple, the religious and symbolic center of Jewish life, was set ablaze during the chaos. It had survived centuries of upheaval. It did not survive this. Its destruction marked more than military defeat. It marked the end of a world centered on a single sacred place. Aftermath of destruction. When the fighting ended, Jerusalem was devastated. Much of the city lay in ruins. Many were killed or captured. Others were displaced. Rome had achieved victory, but it was a victory that reshaped history. A people dispersed. With Jerusalem destroyed, Judea ceased to function as a national center. Survivors scattered. Some were enslaved. Some fled to neighboring regions. Some joined existing Jewish communities abroad. Ancient Israel was no longer defined by geography. It became something carried. Rome's message. Rome rebuilt Jerusalem under a new name. Sacred spaces were replaced. Imperial symbols dominated the landscape. The message was clear. This was not restoration. It was prevention. The final revolt. Decades later, one last rebellion emerged. Led by a charismatic figure, it briefly restored hope. But Rome had learned. This time, the response was swift and overwhelming. Strongholds fell systematically. Resistance was eliminated. The end of national independence. With the final defeat, ancient Israel as a political nation ended. There would be no restored kingdom, no sovereign state, no rebuilt temple. What remained was memory. What Rome could not destroy, Rome destroyed cities. It dismantled institutions, but it could not erase belief. Religious life adapted. Community structures shifted. Traditions moved into homes and texts. Identity survived without territory. A new form of survival. Without land or power, Jewish life transformed. Law replaced location. Learning replaced sacrifice. Community replaced monarchy. This transformation ensured survival, not as an empire, but as a people. Rome believed destruction ended resistance. History proved otherwise. Stories traveled. Memory endured. Identity adapted. What seemed like an ending became a beginning of a different kind. Because ancient Israel did not vanish. It changed form. And in doing so, it reshaped the world that followed. When history expected an ending, by every historical pattern, the story should have ended here. The city was destroyed. The temple no longer stood. The people were scattered far beyond their homeland. Empires had erased nations like this before. When land is lost, armies defeated, and institutions destroyed, history usually moves on. But in this case, it did not. Instead of disappearance, something unexpected began. Survival, not through power, but through transformation. This chapter begins not with conquest, but with endurance, the silence after ruin. After Jerusalem's destruction, the land itself seemed to pause. Roman authority filled the spaces once shaped by ritual and community. Military standards replaced sacred symbols. Administration replaced autonomy. Those who remained lived cautiously, under constant supervision. Those who left carried no possessions of power, only memory. Ancient Israel no longer existed as a state. It existed as a question. How does a people continue when everything that once defined nationhood is gone? Life in dispersion. The survivors did not move together. They scattered in every direction. Some settled in major Roman cities. Others moved eastward into older cultural centers. Some stayed near the ruins, unable or unwilling to leave completely. They adapted outwardly. Languages changed. Clothing changed. Customs blended with local life. But within families, continuity remained. Traditions were repeated. Stories were preserved. Memory was guarded carefully. The challenge of identity, living among other cultures, created a constant tension. Assimilation offered safety. Distinctiveness carried risk. Each community faced the same dilemma. How much change was survival, and how much was loss? The answer varied by place and time. But the effort to remain connected never disappeared. Identity became intentional. Faith without a center. The destruction of the temple forced the most profound transformation. Religious life had once revolved around a single sacred place. Without it, the system could not continue unchanged. Leadership shifted from priests to scholars and teachers. Ritual moved from public sacrifice to household practice. Discussion and interpretation became central. This was not abandonment. It was reinvention. Belief was no longer tied to geography. It could exist anywhere. The rise of learning. Text became the new foundation. Scripture was studied, copied, and debated. Law was interpreted for daily life rather than ritual centers. History was preserved deliberately. Education became portable. A child could learn identity without seeing the land. This shift ensured continuity across distance and time. Community without borders. Physical separation did not prevent connection. Calendars aligned observance across continents. Shared traditions synchronized daily life. Common texts created unity without proximity. Ancient Israel became a global civilization long before the modern world understood globalization. Walls were no longer required. Memory did the work instead. The passing of empires. Rome believed its rule would last forever. History proved otherwise. Centuries passed. Empires rose and collapsed. Borders shifted repeatedly. Through each transition, the scattered communities adapted. They learned new languages. They followed new laws. They survived under changing authorities. The land changed hands. Identity did not. Living as the other, survival carried challenges. Difference drew attention. Cultural continuity sparked suspicion. Success sometimes bred resentment. Treatment varied by region and era. At times, communities were welcomed. At other times, restricted or expelled. Yet continuity endured. Adaptation did not mean disappearance. Memory is cultural resistance. Without armies or political power, resistance took another form. Remembering became an act of defiance. Teaching children preserved continuity. Ritual reinforced belonging. Time, not force, became the greatest ally. Empires ruled generations. Memory outlived them. Waiting across centuries, as generations passed, the homeland became distant. Cities were renamed. Ruins were built over. Maps erased familiar labels. But memory persisted. In prayers, in songs, in shared stories repeated at family tables. Hope survived longer than geography. The irony of history. Rome sought stability through destruction. Instead, it triggered transformation. Ideas rooted in ancient Israel, law, ethics, moral accountability, historical consciousness, spread far beyond the land itself. The influence of a destroyed nation exceeded that of its period of political power. Loss reshaped impact. What ancient Israel became. Ancient Israel was no longer defined by territory. It became a shared memory, a living tradition, a culture in motion. Its survival challenged history's assumptions. A people could lose land, institutions, and sovereignty, and still remain themselves. strength redefined. Survival did not come from military power. It came from flexibility, from learning, from community, from adaptation without erasure. Ancient Israel did not conquer empires. It outlasted them. The question for history: what defines a nation? Is it borders, armies, political control? Or is it memory, belief, and shared identity passed between generations? Ancient Israel answered that question not with force, but with time. Empires fall, cities burn. Borders vanish. But identity, when protected and passed on, can survive what history expects to destroy. Ancient Israel did not disappear. It changed form. And in doing so, it reshaped the world that followed.